Courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes breathing feel like a task. Every seat was filled and all eyes were fixed on the man at the center of it all. Sergeant Nathan Carter sat in his wheelchair dressed in his military uniform, the medals on his chest glinting under the fluorescent lights. His hand gripped the leash of the dog by his side. Thor, a German shepherd with a calm yet watchful demeanor to everyone else. Thor looked like any other military working dog, but to Nathan he was so much more. He was family. Nathan's jaw tightened as the judge addressed him, reminding him that this might be his final chance to speak. The Army had decided Thor was to be reassigned, considered government property needed for another mission. After years of risking their lives together, the thought of losing Thor now felt like a cruel betrayal. Nathan's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady enough to speak, "Your Honor." He began, his tone raw with emotion. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here could ever understand in the field. He pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, even warned me of traps before I could see them, and when I came home, when I couldn't even face myself in the mirror. Thor was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please don't take him from me." The room remained utterly still, the air thick with unspoken sympathy. Some spectators dabbed at their eyes while others exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pity and outrage. The judge's face remained neutral, his eyes studying Nathan for a long moment before he leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling. But before the words could leave his mouth, something unexpected happened. Thor stood abruptly, yanking the leash free from Nathan's trembling hands. The dog moved toward the judge, barking sharply, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The crowd gasped, and the Baith stepped forward instinctively. Though Thor showed no signs of aggression, his barks were insistent, purposeful, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent. Nathan called, his voice breaking with panic, but deep down he knew he had seen this behavior before, countless times on the battlefield. Thor wasn't just barking, he was alerting. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Nathan's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice trembling. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us about something." The judge froze his gavel, forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Thor. The room fell silent again, except for the dog's barks echoing like a heartbeat. Whatever, Thor sensed it wasn't just about Nathan. The dog knew something no one else did, and for the first time that day, Nathan felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something bigger was about to unfold, and Thor was determined to make them all see it. The room was silent except for Thor's relentless barking. Each sharp sound echoed in the vast courtroom, bouncing off the dark wooden walls and cutting through the tension like a blade. Thor's stance was low, his body tense, ears pinned back and eyes locked on the judge's bench. Nathan's grip tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair as he watched the dog. This wasn't random barking. Thor's body language was unmistakable. He had detected something. Nathan's heart pounded, a rush of adrenaline reminding him of moments on the battlefield. But this wasn't war. This was supposed to be a courtroom, a place of order. "Thor, heel." Nathan called, his voice firm but trembling. Thor briefly glanced back at him, his gaze sharp as if to reassure his handler that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Thor returned his focus, pacing in short, deliberate steps in front of the judge's bench. His bark shifted to deep guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience began murmuring nervously, the earlier sympathy for Nathan now morphing into palpable unease. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone laced with irritation. "Control your dog or I will have to, Your Honor." Nathan interrupted, his voice louder, steadier, though his chest tightened with fear. "Thor isn't misbehaving. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong." The room fell silent again as Nathan's words settled in his. Explanation shifted the atmosphere, replacing skepticism with a creeping sense of dread before anyone could respond. Thor suddenly stopped barking. The abrupt silence was jarring, almost deafening. Thor's body went completely rigid as his head snapped toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The shift was so sudden, so intense, that even the judge froze. All eyes turned toward the head-heavy wooden doors leading into the courtroom, a collective unease. Unease settled over the room and the murmurs turned to panicked whispers. Nathan's breathing quickened as he followed Thor's line of sight. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had seen this exact behavior before on the battlefield. Moments before, Thor uncovered a buried explosive or signaled an enemy ambush. Whatever Thor sensed now wasn't good. Nathan whispered, his voice breaking with tension. What is it?" Thor didn't move. His entire body remained locked in place, his growl growing deeper, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever danger he had detected, it was no longer just a threat to Nathan. It was something that could put everyone in that room at risk. The low growl from Thor reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were fixed on the dog, his body tense, his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Even the judge, who moments ago had been prepared to reprimand Nathan, now seemed unnerved. His gavel remained forgotten in his hand as he exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiffs. The air felt electric, thick with a tension that no one could explain. Nathan's breath came faster, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing himself for a blast. He had seen this before too many times to count on the battlefield. Thor's instincts had been the difference between life and death. His warning had always meant one thing: danger was close, very close. "Stay calm," Nathan murmured to himself. But the words felt hollow. Even to him, the BFFs, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated by the judge's bench. One of them, a man with a broad frame and a wary expression, finally stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, though his voice betrayed his own unease, probably reacting to the noise or the crowd. But even as he spoke, his steps were cautious, his movements deliberate. Nathan shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "No, Thor doesn't react to noise. Or people like this. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me if he's growling like that." There's a reason his words hung in the air, and for a moment no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. Thor's growl grew louder as the bailiffs approached the door. The larger man reached out hesitantly, his hand gripping the metal handle for a moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan's heart pounded as he watched every muscle in his body coiled with anticip. Potty Thor's body remained rigid, his growls turning into a series of sharp-clipped barks as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway. Beyond, at first, it seemed empty, but Thor's barking only intensified. His eyes fixed on something unseen, the larger bailiff took a step into the hallway, his hands still on his weapon. He glanced back at the courtroom, his face pale, and then turned forward again. A second later, his voice broke the silence. "There's something here." Nathan's pulse quickened as he leaned forward in his chair, his chest tight with dread. Whatever something the bailiff had seen, it was enough to make Thor's instincts flare to life, and Nathan knew better than anyone Thor was never wrong. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as if the tension itself was pulling the oxygen from the room. Thor's barking echoed sharply, each sound reverberating off the wooden walls. His body remained locked in a stance of pure alertness, muscles taut, head low, and his gaze fixed on the dark hallway beyond the open door. The larger BFF, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. His hand hovered near his weapon, his body stiff with caution as though expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. "What's going on out there?" The judge demanded, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to maintain authority. He gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles pale as his eyes darted nervously between the doorway and Thor. The dogs' growls deepened a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the courtroom and sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the room, his face pale and tight with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said. Hesitantly, his words measured, but something doesn't feel right. His gaze shifted back to the hallway, his brow furrowed as if trying to shake off his own doubts. "It's quiet. Too quiet." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. He had heard those words before, too quiet countless times on the battlefield, and they had always preceded disaster. His voice rose, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Thor doesn't react to nothing if he's acting like this. There's a reason we need to evacuate the room." The bright light cut through the shadows, illuminating the length of the polished floor. "There's nothing." He muttered, his tone uneasy. "It's just an empty hallway." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm facade. Thor, however, was far from calm. The dog's growling only grew louder, his barking more frantic as his body strained forward, almost yanking the leash from Nathan's grip. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the hallway, the sound unmistakable and jarring in the suffocating silence. The smaller BFF flinched, his flashlight beam shaking as he instinctively stepped back. Thor lunged toward the sound, barking ferociously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained against his leash. Gasps erupted from the courtroom and panic began to ripple through the crowd. The larger bailiff instinctively drew his weapon, his voice tight with alarm. What the hell was that? Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his voice above the chaos. "Get Thor back," he yelled, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and certainty. "He's never wrong, something's coming." But before anyone could respond, the metallic clang echoed again, louder this time, as if whatever had caused it was now much closer. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible energy that sent a wave of dread through the room. Whatever Thor had sensed, it was no longer a question of if, it was now a question of when. The metallic clang echoed again, sharper, closer, like an alarm ringing in the depths of the hallway. The tension in the courtroom snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Thor barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash as though his sheer will could push through the doorway and confront whatever was out there. Nathan gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white. His pulse racing in his ears, he could feel it now too. Something was wrong, something was coming. The larger BFF stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent and still. Yet Thor's barking didn't waver, his growls growing deeper, more insistent. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for an evacuation, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" The judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled slightly in his hand, and his usual air of authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear. The larger BFF glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with W. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke whatever might be lurking, "but it doesn't feel right." He took another step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hall. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their belongings, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room was spreading like wildfire. Nathan wheeled himself forward slightly, his eyes locked on Thor, who had gone silent again. The dog's ears were rigid, his body motionless. His eyes still fixed on the open doorway. Thor's locked onto something. Nathan said, his voice trembling. I don't know what it is, but it's there. And then just as the bailiff reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make the smaller BFF stumble backward. His flashlight beam jerking wildly. There he shouted. His voice filled with panic. The larger BFF froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Thor erupted into barking again, lunging so hard against his leash that Nathan's grip nearly gave out back up. Nathan shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. Get out of there! The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats, murmurs turning to shouts as the panic spread. And then from the darkness of the hallway came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't rushed, it was calm, and it was getting closer. Thor's barking turned into a snarl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. Nathan felt his chest tighten as dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry, it wasn't hiding. It was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The heavy footstep echoed louder than the courtroom could bear, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Thor's snarls filled the air, his body pulling against the leash with such force that Nathan had to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now, every pair of eyes locked on. Thor's growls were now constant, low, and guttural. Vibrating through the tense courtroom, the bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. Step forward slowly, the larger Baith ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Nathan's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hands slowly, the motion causing both BFFs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. Relax, the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. I'm not here to hurt anyone, but the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Nathan knew immediately this man was lying, and Thor knew it too. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Thor's growls were now constant, low, and guttural. Vibrating through the tense courtroom, the bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. Step forward slowly, the larger Baith ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man took another step closer, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Nathan's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hands slowly, the motion causing both BFFs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. Relax, the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. I'm not here to hurt anyone, but the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Nathan knew immediately this man was lying, and Thor knew it too. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Thor's growls were now constant, low, and guttural. Vibrating through the tense courtroom, the bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. Step forward slowly, the larger Baith ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man took another step closer, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Nathan's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hands slowly, the motion causing both BFFs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. I'm not here to hurt anyone, but the way he spoke the way,